Hello and welcome to Grief Tending. This is a podcast series that's aimed at supporting anyone who is in a caregiving role to someone who is or will be grieving. Whether you're a friend, family, neighbor, community member, supporting someone in your life who is grieving either as a result of living with illness or living in bereavement after someone has died, or if you are a paid or professional caregiver, maybe working in healthcare or elsewhere in community, everyone is welcome. These conversations are seeking to cultivate our collective capacities to be alongside grief in supportive ways, with the recognition that grief is a deeply human experience and that everyone in community has a role to play in being supportive and helpful. We'd like to start by acknowledging traditional owners and custodians on whose unceded lands these interviews are recorded, Turrbal and Yagara people, to acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, waters and culture, to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect and welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander listeners. This episode is called On Grief as a Gateway to Transformation, Encounters with the Depths of Human Experience. And our guest is Francis Weller. And Francis is a psychotherapist, a writer and soul activist. And for 40 years he has been working as a psychotherapist in developing a style that he calls soul-centered psychotherapy. Francis is the author of a number of books, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief, The Threshold Between Loss and Revelation, which he wrote with Rashani Ria, as well as the essay collection In the Absence of the Ordinary, Essays in a Time of Uncertainty. Francis has introduced thousands of people to the healing work of ritual in the course of his career, and as a gifted therapist and teacher, he's been described as something of a jazz artist, improvising and moving fluidly in and out of deep emotional territories with groups and individuals, bringing imagination and attention to places that are often held with judgment and shame. There are a range of online courses that Francis offers, as well as audio teachings on his website. Francis received his BA from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and has 2 master's degrees from John F. Kennedy University in clinical psychology and transpersonal psychology. Francis's writings have appeared in various anthologies and journals, exploring the confluence between psyche, nature, and culture. Francis is also on staff at the Commonweal Cancer Help Program and is frequently a presenter and keynote speaker at conferences. He's taught at Sonoma State University as well as the Sophia Center in Oakland, and has been a featured teacher at the Minnesota Men's Conference. He's currently completing his 4th book, The Alchemy of Initiation, Soul Work and the Art of Ripening. So in this episode on grief as a gateway to transformation, encounters with the depths of human experience, Francis shares some core ideas from his writing and his practice over the years, reflecting on what it can mean to take an approach, a soulful approach, or we might say a depth approach to working with grief. So if this is something that's not familiar to you, maybe it might be helpful to think of, there's certain experiences in life, emotional experiences, we could say love, joy, happiness, for example, where there is a sense of motion or movement that we often attach to these. So we do that literally in language. We can say that we feel uplifted, we can say we feel overjoyed, this movement upwards. So it is also that sense of movement shows up, literally people in experiences of grief. People talk about feeling down, feeling the weight of grief and sorrow, feeling burdened. So Francis talks about what it might mean to think about grief as a descent into the depths of our lives, but also if we think symbolically, imagine in terms of story or fairy tales and myths. You're probably familiar, as a young one, of hearing stories of the descent into the underworld. So what might it mean to think and speak and approach grief in these ways? Francis is in a lineage of therapy that is very familiar in speaking with these things, and I really value that he's able to draw on historical ideas, both from academic, therapeutic spaces, but also from myth and from story and poetry and literature. Another idea that Francis introduces us to is this concept of an apprenticeship with sorrow. It's one of the central aspects in his book, and The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And this idea of grief being something that we are not skilled at first, that needs to be learned, but that is learned over a long period of time. So again, changing the dynamic of imagining grief as something that we need to get over, move on from, leave behind. But an apprenticeship with sorrow is this idea of a core human faculty, and becoming familiar with it over the course of our lives, and in the process learning the skills of what it might mean to become something of a mature human, not necessarily related in age, but more in skill, so that the result of this apprenticeship with sorrow, as you'll hear Francis talk about, is not mastery, but elderhood, to develop a type of wisdom in life. And Francis also speaks in a range of ways and reflects on the importance of grief not being held in isolation. So the privatization of grief is something that is a key idea in his writings, but is one that a number of guests in this episode have spoken to. The medicine of communal ritual, the healing that takes place when people have spaces to hear from and listen to grieving people together. And the ways in which navigating grief not on our own means that the weight that we might experience and that burden is not carried by our single pair of arms, but is carried more by the collective. And Francis highlights how this has been, for our deep time history, this has been the way that grief has been related to. And in many ways his approach is seeking to remember that, and then to bring a sense of renewal to how we approach being alongside grief as a deeply human experience. So it seems really fitting that this episode concludes our series, because the name Grief Tending comes from Francis's ideas and writings. This is something he has been speaking to for many decades. So we have, in the literal sense, saved the best till last, and there are links to Francis's writings and his work with this episode as well. So whoever you are, and wherever you are in community, and whatever your role in supporting people who are grieving, I hope this conversation is supportive to you. Hi Francis, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here with you, Alam. Pleasure.
So you've been working alongside people who are grieving, in a therapeutic sense as a psychotherapist, in a community ritual sense as a facilitator and an educator for well over 3 decades now. And you've written about, kind of some of the broader societal and cultural impacts of, what the toll it takes for people who are grieving when there isn't a understanding of grief. So, in the dominant culture of the West, you've written about how there can be an astonishing lack of courtesy and compassion shown to grief. And, you link this to how these days people are often expected to grieve mostly privately, and then after a few short months, sort of pressure to move on, to get back to some sort of normal. I wondered if you could share with us why you think it is there's such a lack of courtesy shown to grief, and what might it look like to take more of a courteous or compassionate approach?
Excellent question. Well, I think both of our societies live in what we could call a grief-phobic culture. There's something about the territory of grief where we're taken when we're in the throes of sorrow, which is downward. We're taken to our knees. We're taken to the vulnerabilities, the feelings of how susceptible we are to life. And we live in a very heroic culture. So the idea in the heroic culture is to be in control, to always be successful, to be dominant, to be rising above it, to always be successful. And grief has an opposite trajectory, doesn't it? It takes us down into the place where we are so utterly human, and where the vulnerability of our human flesh and our human affections and our love and our attachments are all subject to loss and disruption. And so the territory itself that we're taken into, we don't know how to navigate that territory. It's so anti-heroic. And the hero is also exceedingly solitary, isn't it? I mean, the idea of the hero is exceedingly solitary. So when grief does come up, as you said, we're kind of expected to marshal it alone, to overcome it, to get beyond it. So there's nothing in the societal structure that sees it as really the commons of the soul, that all of us, every person you see on the street, will either have, has having, or will have profound losses in their life. No one will be accepted from that reality. So if we could acknowledge this collectively, that this is part of what we all share, that territory could become exceedingly rich and deep and dense in its, in its capacity to really mend and heal who we are, what we need, what we feel when grief shows its face, and it will show its face. Yeah.
And in speaking about the ways that grief will show its face to all of us, one of the core themes in your writing and teaching has been this invitation for people to take up an apprenticeship with sorrow, and it's quite a specific choice, I suppose. This term of apprenticeship. So I wanted to ask you to expand on that.
Well, that idea came slowly after sitting with many, many people in my therapy practice and also in the grief ritual settings, that grief is always around us.
Yes,
When we get
yes.
beyond the idea of my personal losses, the loss of a child or the loss of a marriage or the loss of a home, the loss of a beloved animal friend, there are other ways in which grief shows up every day. Losses to our own integrity, losses to pieces of my being that's were deemed unacceptable. Losses to the planet right now are just innumerable and weighing upon us every day. There's other forms of losses too. We could say even ancestral losses. So the idea here with the apprenticeship is that if I do not develop some of the core capacities to deal with grief, my only option will be to shut down, will be to, in a sense, close the heart off from life because it's just too much. The apprenticeship says that grief is not just an emotion, but a core human faculty. And this faculty must be cultivated over time. And that idea of apprenticeship also suggests a long course of study, as the old apprenticeships were, 5, 10, 15 years of studying to become a master painter or a carpenter or a weaver or a potter. In the work of soul and the work of grief, that prolonged study doesn't lead to mastery, but it leads to elderhood. It leads to someone who has digested life on life's terms and recognizes that in order to stay alive, to stay connected to life, and to participate in the generation of life, I have to know how to navigate the inevitable times of grief and loss. So the apprenticeship is long, it's lifelong, basically, but it's what keeps us susceptible to beauty, to joy, to aliveness. Like I said, otherwise, if we don't take up this apprenticeship, we have to live strategically around grief. And that usually means, how do I avoid it? How do I try to minimize it? rather than seeing it as the necessary element in the deepening and ripening of my own character. And I think that goes for cultures as well. A culture that knows how to grieve knows how to live.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and it strikes me as it really turns on its head this idea of grief being something to cope with or be competent with from the outset. You know, this idea of learning gradually, and it's one of the things really that this series is hoping to do is encourage and invite people, particularly those who are in the circles of care around someone who is either living with serious illness or supporting a family or friend who's bereaved. And I think there seems like a more gentle approach, almost of kind of self compassion, of allowing like, oh, this
Mm,
is something we learn over a much longer period, rather than something we become, you know, develop strategies for and become competent in
right,
a very
right.
short time.
Well, we could say, in that apprenticeship, self compassion is one of the key skills. How do we hold this gently? See, the idea is that grief should always be moving. And in order for grief to move, it needs to stay warm. So our apprenticeship is about how do I, in a sense, as best I can, strike up a relationship with grief rather than ward it off as some kind of intrusive enemy. But how do I begin to see it as evidence of love, as the evidence of my deepest humanity? And if I can bring warmth to that, the grief can stay soft and pliable. It can keep moving. When our approach is suspicious or uh, hostile, grief will harden and congeal and turn cold, and it will not move. And I think that's really the symptom of someone who they call it congestive heart failure, but it really is this um, immobilization of grief in the heart. And that's when we have to, well, the long term effect of that is that it leads to bitterness. So when grief moves and is allowed to be expressed ongoingly, we don't stay locked up in that room. We begin to feel deepened, moved, ripened, enriched. Um, we come out of that time in the underworld carrying medicines for the family, for our community, for culture. Things happen in the depths down there. We're remade and reshaped in times of grief. If you really take up that apprenticeship, you don't come out of that time the same as you went in. It's a prolonged reshaping of character, you know. Yeah.
And I think this idea of the depths and the underworld is something that is a recurrent theme in your writing and in the lineage that you practice in. And I wanted to turn towards that now and thinking about it in relation to, it can be one of the things that's so disorienting and frightening for people, I think, in experiencing grief, this sense of feeling utterly lost within their own lives. Sometimes this is called, the dark night of the soul. And you write in quite poetic and symbolic terms around this sense of being in the dark, how grief can draw people into this kind of this night world. Um, but rather than seeking to escape or bypass it, you suggesting that these parts of our lives have deep significance and value, and as you were saying, can be these thresholds for transformation. Um, so I wanted to ask you to speak more about this, particularly this idea of learning and developing capacities to be in those spaces. And you even talk about learning to see in the dark. So I wonder if you could expand on all of that.
This is one of those themes that is so connected to the idea that heroic impulse and that sense of ascension and rising. We like the light. We always, even in our spiritual traditions, we're always talking about enlightenment or moving towards the light. But soul, particularly in these times of vulnerability, takes us into the darkness. And our associations with darkness, by and large, are very negative. They're associated with, failure, with fear, with defeat, with evil. All of the associations, by and large, are very negative. What we need to do is redeem that place of darkness as a holy ground. Some things can only happen in the darkness. That's why when we're taken down into that underworld in grief, there are certain things that happen down there. Shedding of old skins, old ideologies, old stories about oneself. And there's almost as if the composting that happens in the dark is seeding us for some new life. And there's a gestational time in that darkness. We are waiting, we're brooding, we're allowing something to come up out of the darkness that we could never have imagined or have found in the light. There's a wonderful line by the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He said, "And yet, no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence." So there's something in the darkness that we cannot control, but that is absolutely indispensable for us leading a life of depth, right? I mean, look, the language we even speak of, the depths, we're taken down into these deep places. In many cultures, after there's been a major loss, they imagine that where you are living now is in that underworld territory. And nothing is expected of you, sometimes for upwards of a year, because they know the work that's going on down there is the reshaping of this person. And what they return with, as they do in the fairy tales and the myths, there are treasures down there in the depths. And we come back, like I said before, bringing medicine, a deepened capacity to be with uncertainty, with fear, with sorrow, a deepened ability to be with the young ones who are inevitably facing things right now in the culture and on the planet that are filled with grief. So we need people who are capable of not only um, enduring their time in the darkness, but are willing to come back as carriers of grief medicine.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it strikes me as just such a different framing than either someone being expected to stay away from the parts that are messy or require us having less capacity. There's such pressure placed on people in grief to quote
Yeah.
unquote keep functioning or stay productive. And the processes you are talking about are ones which really require time and space and capacity to be able to attend to. And this can look. I'm thinking of other guests in this series who've spoken about sometimes grief support can look very practical. If there's ways within a family network, for example, to support someone financially to have time off work, that's one way this can be done. Or supporting someone to get out into nature, and to have times where they are immersing themselves in just more spaciousness than they might normally. So I'm just trying to think, in relation to the things you're saying around the depths that these processes can take and the deep disorientation that can be present for people, thinking about the role of supporters and people around, how people can try and attend to this in ways that show compassion and courtesy.
Well, I think just the basic idea of understanding that they're no longer living in the daylit world. So, someone, if you're a friend or your family member is dealing with a major loss, to know that they have left the ordinary world, They're not living in the same world as grocery stores and dealing with budgets, and that's not where they are. So our language and our ability to meet them where they are is very, very important. To not demand a whole lot of daily activities, but to say, I know that you're traveling in another world right now. And just to let you know that we are here for you. You are tethered to our love, and that we are here to support where you're traveling. We know we can't go with you, but do know that we're here with you. So there's a certain spaciousness that is exceedingly is exceedingly hospitable to the person who's undergoing that underworld journey. So that we're not putting expectations on them to somehow do more, be more, because they're already fully, in a sense, occupied. Their employment now is in the underworld. And we want that to be meaningful and for their return to be supported and not aborted. Mm.
In thinking about that piece you named about being tethered, tethered by love to the relationships of people around, I wanted to ask you about the sense of isolation or inner loneliness that can be so present. It's sometimes grieving people will speak about how even though they may be surrounded physically, geographically by other people, that they have a sense of deep aloneness and alienation within that. And you've linked that sense of isolation in contemporary life more broadly to sort of wider cultural and societal influences, the medicalization of grief, the impacts of colonization, Western society's real dominant emphasis on self-reliance. And so I'm reminded, like, in contrast to this myth of us as separate individuals, in broader cultural conversations around decolonization, for example, there's numerous indigenous worldviews emphasize a foundational interconnectedness of life. Webs of relationality between individuals and between communities, and then the natural or the more than human world. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak about how different integrated ways of being and existing in the world, like what difference that makes beyond, or specifically to, this idea of my grief or my individual grief. It's a very different framing, it seems, to be relating to the world as me with my grief alone versus me going through this dark time or this passage through the underworld, as we might describe it symbolically, but still tethered to much broader webs of relationality. So I just wanted to invite you to speak on that.
There's quite a few threads in that question. Good ones, though. One of them is that, in our long story as a species, grief has always been communal. It has always been rooted in the ground of community. So what we're experiencing right now, particularly in white, technological, capitalistic society, is really not the norm. That's why it feels so weird when we go into grief that there's some sense of solitary confinement around it. Like, again, I'm being asked to carry this alone, and I can't. It's impossible to carry the cargo of grief solitarily. It requires many arms, many hearts. So when we gather together in ritual space, and there are 20 to 40 other people in that space, we're reminded of a deep archetypal soul truth that this is what I need in order to keep grief moving. And that's the beauty, I think, of a lot of traditional cultures, is that they have kept that communal context around the whole spectrum of being alive as a human being, from birth to death and beyond, even to becoming an ancestor. The covering was always there. Jeanette Armstrong, who is an Okanagan elder from British Columbia area in northern Washington and up into Canada, speaks how in her culture, in the Okanagan people, they frame their worldview this way: community is first, family is second, and the individual is last. So that no matter what occurs in your lifetime, the community and the family provide cover for you. So no matter whatever losses that happen, whatever illnesses that you encounter, you will be supported. What we have done in our society is invert that completely. So it's the individual first, family second, and community has become kind of empty rhetoric. We talk about it all the time, but it doesn't have much blood in it. There's not much, bone to the community that we're exposed to. So we are always kind of filtering back to that sense of solitary, carrying this in a solitary way. And in the apprenticeship, I do talk about the necessity of cultivating a relationship to silence and solitude, because much of our time will be spent there. So if I'm not fighting grief, there's a possibility that I could turn this time of solitude into something like a sanctuary, where the work of grief goes on, and I am in relationship to it through writing, through drawing, through painting, through dance, through, reverie, through dealing, bringing the photographs, whatever it is I'm working with. I have a chance to really shape this isolation into deep solitude. Another one of Rilke's beautiful lines, he says, I am too alone in the world, but not alone enough to make every moment holy. So there's that invitational space in grief to turn towards that space and greet it and enter into that as really a sanctuary time. That being said, we also need that larger holding space in order for the grief to move. I've written about the idea that grief requires both containment and release. And if I'm left to this by myself, I can't do both jobs. So I can't both contain and release. So I end up becoming a permanent containment field for sorrow. And what we end up doing is spending a lifetime of just circulating old sorrows. And they never really have a chance to be set down. And most likely, we're also circulating ancestral sorrows, generations and generations of grief that hasn't been set down, that hasn't been moved adequately, or offered a congenial space that says this is welcomed here. And we're all going to share this. And you brought one other point up, Elam, that I really liked, which was this idea of privatization of the grief. When we gather for a grief ritual, one of the first things we do after singing and movement and dance and drumming is people will share one thread of grief that came in the door with them. Usually people have, many threads of grief, but everyone shares one major thread that they've been carrying. And at the end of that, I says, well, was any grief shared that you could not relate to? And of course, everybody says no, even though I may not have had a brother die by suicide or a divorce or a child die, or still I can recognize your experience because it's a shared experience. The commons of the soul is that we all know grief. And this is when I begin the idea of shifting it from, well, this is my grief, to, no, this is our communal cup of grief. This is our shared sorrow. And it's up to all of us to work together to bring imagination, to bring beauty, to bring ritual as a way of moving this cup and emptying it a small amount. So even if I don't grieve that weekend and someone else does, I go away different. And village mind, which is again so much part of traditional indigenous culture, is village mind. So different than the individualism of our white society. In village mind, there's a sense of, well, you wept this time, I will be on the floor next time. And you'll be there for me. Because that's the wisdom of ritual, is repetition. We get to go to that shrine many, many times over the course of a year, If we were a healthy society, there'd be a grief ritual someplace in the community every month. But we are not a healthy society. So, we've offered grief rituals for 20 some odd years, 25 years. And we've had people come from Australia. We've had people come from England and Canada and Germany and all around the United States. And I say, thank you for coming. It's wonderful that you're here. But this is a symptom. This is at the heart of our grief, is this profound amnesia that we have forgotten how to be human beings with one another, that we've forgotten how to tend one another in times of loss. So it's great that you're here, but this should be happening in every community. You shouldn't have to travel 8,000 miles for the privilege of weeping next to another human being without questioning it, and have it be welcomed and honored and celebrated and thanked. We actually thank the participants during the ritual process when they come back to the community. They're always thanked for what they shared, what they offered, because it was a communal gesture, not just a private gesture. So I have some feeling about that.
Yeah, and I can, I feel the tenderness and the care in that, but the kind of double edgedness of it in terms of the reflection of what is lacking for so many, very often, yeah, people who've lost connection to those older threads, those cultural threads.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's where, sort of the last thing I wanted to ask you about was in relation to this, I think, and the role that people who have been living with grief, especially death related grief and bereavement, and have been through, whether or not people have had language or framework of understanding it in terms of going through this dark night of the soul or in the underworld, things like this. You so often talk about that journey is part of a process, and then that people can return to the village, to the community, with some medicine, with
Yes.
something to offer back. And this is, I think, sadly, so often missing from the framing again when grief is held in a medicalized and therefore individualized. Oh, this is my grief and this is my thing to work through, and then somehow return to a normal. It's very different to think about that in contrast as a way in which you talk about grief being essential to finding and maintaining an emotional intimacy with life and with one another and with our own souls. And then you step on and you talk about how this can enrich not only an individual's life but the broader community. I just wanted to ask you to speak more about that aspect.
Mm. Yeah, I've had the pleasure for the last 14 or 15 years of co-facilitating the Cancer Help Program twice a year at a place called Commonweal here in Marin County, California. And somewhere during the long week that we're together, I'll share what I call these 10 practices to optimize the healing response to their cancer. And they're, don't have to be limited to cancer, obviously. And I say number one is number one. You can do these in any order you want, but number one is number one. And that is self-compassion. And let's keep number 10, number 10. And number 10 is service. And what I mean there is that at some point in your healing process, you begin to realize that this was not meant for me alone. That what I've gathered in this long journey with cancer or this long journey with grief reshaped me, made me more aware of what it means to be in this delicate journey of being a human being. And so you come back with things to give away, not to pronounce or not to convince, but to share. This is what I saw in that time in the darkness, in that holy ground of darkness. This is what I encountered when I fell to my knees and felt my own vulnerability and my own inability in the moment to be muscular and strong. And this is what I've come back with. And so I tell them that at some point, you'll know that it's time to begin to throw yourself like seed and see what it is that lands out there in a fertile way, so that what you found in the darkness has now been translated into something that can yield something generous, something healing, something insightful, something meaningful to the next person on the trail. Because the trail will never be empty. The trail will always be filled. There are those ahead of us, those walking with us, and those walking behind us. And, you know, we can always offer something from our time in that darkness.
Mm, mm. And I've heard you speak about this as ordinary medicine, which is a phrase I, often refer to. It kind of, yeah, it both speaks to the need of sharing the learnings, or sometimes very painfully learned lessons of grief, but also emphasizes the role that that that's shared within community, rather than being um, the expertise of a mental health
Right,
professional or something like this.
right, right. Yeah, I'm in the middle of a 5-month online grief ritual training process right now. And one of the first questions that came up was, well, do I need to be a therapist to do this work? And I said, well, if we're waiting for only the therapist to do this work, we're in big trouble. This is ordinary work done by ordinary people to address an ordinary thing. There's almost nothing more ordinary than grief. But because we've ostracized it and, in a sense, cloistered it in some other room in the house, we don't know how to relate to it as an ordinary thing. Uh, but again, this is what we're asked to do as an ordinary person, is to know how to walk alongside someone in grief, and also to walk alongside our own experience in grief. And that is what I think we need to learn. It's a sweet little poem by Denise Levertov where she said, to speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. So without a language to speak to grief, without some hospitality towards grief, our relationship to our own aliveness and our relationship to life itself is going to be blocked. It's going to be hindered. So we do this again, not just to feel, you know, less sad, but to feel more alive. That really is the heart of the work. Grief is exceedingly alive. It is not depressive. It is not deadening. When you really allow grief to touch you, you feel a kind of a current moving through you that is very alive. Not comfortable, not pleasant. It is a difficult guest. But if you can be faithful to that guest, it will show you things and reveal things about your own soul that you never knew. I have deep faith in grief.
Thank you so much, Francis, for those reflections, and for, yeah, your work and your writing has been very influential on, us here at Hummingbird House, but also, I know a number of other practitioners as well. And even the name of this series comes, in part from your work, and sort of this invitation to tend to grief, and to speak to these apprenticeships with sorrow, and that it is ordinary work, as you say, for ordinary people. And so our hope is that, yeah, people listening may feel drawn to explore further some of your work, and connect into these
Mm,
ways of understanding and
mm,
relating to grief. So
mm.
thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you, Elam, and thank you, Hummingbird House, for making a space for grief in the world. And to me, these are really holy places. These are places where our deepest humanity has a chance to be expressed. I guess my last word would be that there is no love without loss, and there's no loss that does not somehow acknowledge that love was there, is present. So our love is entangled with grief. And if we want to really honor the love that we've had for those that we lost, then we have to practice the rites of grief. They are the ways that love stays alive and stays current. You know, that really is the work of the heart. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you again.